that's the show that I'm doing for NBC, and I think people are going to like it. I'm comfortable, really, for the first time since MASH.
The 70s and 80s gave us some of the greatest sitcoms of all time, shows we still love today. But for every classic, there was a train wreck. We're counting down the shows that everyone seemed to hate, from bizarre concepts to terrible spin-offs that tarnished the legacies of beloved characters. You won't believe how badly one show ruined the ending of a sitcom giant. 1. Hello, Larry.
Yesterday, Ruthie mentioned that she was interested in music.
2 days ago, she said she wanted to jump out of an airplane. Hope you didn't buy her a parachute.
The name Hello, Larry has become a punchline, a shorthand for a terrible, failed sitcom. But what people often forget is that this show was a spin-off of the popular NBC series Different Strokes. The character of Larry Alder, a talk radio host, was introduced as the man who bought the Drummonds Company. The idea was to use a popular show to launch a new one. Truth be told, it was a spectacular failure. The show followed Larry as he moved to Portland, Oregon, with his 2 teenage daughters to host a call-in advice show. He was meant to be a hip, relatable dad, but he came across as bland and uninteresting. The biggest problem was the writing. The jokes were flat, the situations were cliché, and there was zero chemistry between the cast members. It felt like a generic family sitcom with no heart. The network tried everything to save it, including frequent crossover episodes where characters like Arnold and Drummond would show up in Portland to boost ratings. But as bad as it was to see a new character fail, it was even more painful when beloved characters from a hit show were given their own disaster. 2. Joni Loves Chachi.
I thought the whole thing was kind of beautiful, didn't you?
Oh, I thought it was 2 boring people going to see fish.
Well, it's a lot more exciting than what we're doing.
If you thought, Hello, Larry was a painful spin-off, get ready for Joni Loves Chachi. This show took 2 popular supporting characters from the #1 show in America, Happy Days, and gave them their own series. It should have been a slam dunk. Joni Cunningham and Chachi Arcola were the show's adorable teen sweethearts. The spin-off followed their journey to Chicago to pursue a rock and roll career, with Chachi's mom and stepdad running a restaurant to support them. It was meant to be a mix of music, romance, and comedy. What could go wrong? Well, pretty much everything. The central issue was that Joni and Chachi, who were charming in small doses on Happy Days, just weren't interesting enough to carry their own show. Their entire dynamic was based on their on-again, off-again romance, and it got repetitive fast. The musical numbers felt forced and cheesy, like a low-budget imitation of an old Frankie and Avalon movie. Audiences who loved them in Fonzie's world were completely uninterested in their solo adventures. The ratings were dismal from the start. After just 2 short seasons, the show was canceled, and the characters were awkwardly reabsorbed back into Happy Days for its final season, where they quickly got married to give their story some kind of closure. It was a clear sign that sometimes less is more. But even a failed romance is better than a show that actively ruined the legacy of its parent program.
3.
Three's a Crowd.
It's a present from my mother.
I think I'm going to like your mother better than your father.
For 8 seasons, Three's Company was a ratings powerhouse built on a simple, silly premise. One man pretending to be a certain way to live with 2 female roommates. When it finally came time to end the show, ABC executives made a decision that is still baffling to fans. Instead of giving the show a proper finale, they decided to launch a spin-off from its final episode. This spin-off, Three's a Crowd, completely discarded 2/3 of the main cast. In the last moments of Three's Company, Jack Tripper, played by John Ritter, finally falls in love with a new character, Vicky Bradford. The new show follows Jack as he moves in with Vicky, only to clash with her disapproving, wealthy father, who happens to live right downstairs. Fans were furious. They had spent 8 years invested in the friendship between Jack, Janet, and Terry. To see the women unceremoniously dropped for a new, less interesting premise felt like a betrayal. The new show was just a bland, generic couples sitcom. The magic was gone. The core conflict, the disapproving dad, was a tired trope that couldn't compare to the zany misunderstandings of the original. The show was a ratings disaster and was canceled after a single season. It not only failed on its own, but it retroactively ruined the ending of Three's Company, leaving a sour taste in the mouths of millions of fans. It was a spin-off disaster, but at least it came from a sitcom. Our next entry tried to spin off a beloved character from a bar.
4th, the Tortellis.
And I want you to meet my fiancée, Loretta, and see for yourself that the photos were not retouched.
Cheers is widely considered one of the greatest sitcoms of all time, a masterpiece of writing and character development. So, when the network decided to create a spin-off, expectations were high. Unfortunately, they chose to build it around Carla Tortelli's sleazy, unfaithful ex-husband, Nick Tortelli, and his new ditzy blonde wife, Loretta. The show, titled The Tortellis, moved Nick and Loretta from Boston to Las Vegas, where Loretta was trying to launch her career as a showgirl. The plot revolved around Nick's constant schemes and his attempts to reconcile with his estranged son. Here's the kicker. Nobody liked Nick Tortelli. He was a funny side character on Cheers precisely because he was a loathsome buffoon who would show up for a few minutes to annoy Carla and then leave. Making him the star of his own show was a massive miscalculation. Viewers had no interest in spending 30 minutes a week with a character they were supposed to despise. The show was loud, obnoxious, and lacked any of the wit or charm that made Cheers a hit. Rhea Perlman and George Wendt even made guest appearances as Carla and Norm to try and save the sinking ship, but it was no use. The show was critically panned and swiftly canceled after just 13 episodes. It served as a powerful lesson that not every character deserves a spotlight. But as bad as a failed spin-off is, it's nothing compared to a comeback vehicle for a star that crashes and burns. 5. She's the Sheriff.
She's the sheriff.
And I got my hands full. I got a deputy who's out to get my job. Plus, I'm trying to raise 2 kids of my own with the help of my dear old mom.
After being famously fired from Three's Company, Suzanne Summers spent years away from the sitcom world. In 1987, she made her grand return in a show called She's the Sheriff. The premise was high concept and felt tailor-made for the era. Summers played Hildy Granger, a mother of 2 living in a small Nevada town. After her sheriff husband's untimely passing, the town council appoints her as the new sheriff, assuming she'll be a pushover they can control. Of course, she turns out to be surprisingly competent, using common sense and motherly intuition to solve crimes, much to the chagrin of her chauvinistic deputy. On paper, it sounds like a decent idea for a light-hearted comedy. In execution, it was a disaster. The show was produced for first-run syndication, meaning it didn't have the budget or writing quality of a major network show. The jokes were incredibly lame, the plots were predictable, and the tone was just cheesy. Critics absolutely savaged it, calling it witless, unfunny, and a poor vehicle for Summers. Despite the terrible reviews, the show was cheap to produce and was sold to enough local stations to stay on the air for 2 seasons. However, it never found a real audience and is now remembered as a prime example of a corny, disliked 80s sitcom that did nothing to help its star's career. It was a rough comeback, but not nearly as tragic as seeing one of TV's biggest legends fail.
6. Life with Lucy.
Believe me, he'll know Curtis is like Santa Claus. No matter how far away he is, he knows if you've been bad or good.
Lucille Ball is arguably the most important and beloved figure in television history. I Love Lucy, The Lucy Show, and Here's Lucy were all massive, long-running hits that defined the sitcom genre for decades. So, in 1986, When it was announced that the 75-year-old legend was returning to television with a new sitcom called Life with Lucy, it was treated as a major event. The show cast Lucy as a widowed grandmother, Lucy Barker, who inherits half of her late husband's hardware store. The other half was owned by her stuffy, straight-laced son-in-law, played by her longtime co-star, Gail Gordon. This created the classic Lucy setup, a wacky, scheme-loving redhead driving a grumpy authority figure crazy. But the magic was gone. What was charming and hilarious in the 1950s and 60s felt tired and sad in 1986. Watching the elderly Lucy get into elaborate physical comedy stunts was more uncomfortable than funny. The writing felt dated, like a carbon copy of her old shows without any of the spark. The ratings were abysmal from the very first episode. Critics were gentle out of respect for her legacy, but the consensus was clear this was a mistake. ABC canceled the show after only 8 of the 13 filmed episodes had aired. It was a heartbreaking final chapter to an unparalleled career. A show so disliked, it proved that even the biggest star in TV history can't save a bad idea. While Lucy's show felt sadly human, the next one felt disturbingly inhuman. 7. Small Wonder.
Clear the table and put everything in the sink. Put everything in the sink.
There are bad sitcoms, and then there are sitcoms that are so fundamentally strange and creepy, they become the stuff of legend. Small Wonder is one of those shows. The premise revolves around Ted Lawson, a robotics engineer who creates a ridiculously advanced android in the form of a 10-year-old girl. He brings the robot home and tries to pass her off as his adopted daughter, Vicky. Her name was actually an acronym that stood for Voice Input Child Identicant. The comedy was supposed to come from Vicky's literal interpretation of human language and her attempts to understand human behavior, all while the Lawson family struggled to keep her robotic identity a secret from their nosy, obnoxious neighbors, the Brindles. The problem was, Vicky was terrifying. Played by actress Tiffany Brissett, the character moved with a stiff, unsettling gait and spoke in a flat, robotic monotone. She wasn't charming or cute. She was pure uncanny valley. Add to that her super strength and hidden electrical outlet under her arm, and you had a recipe for nightmare fuel, not family fun. The writing was awful, relying on the same one-note joke over and over again. Vicky misunderstands something, and chaos ensues. Despite being critically panned and widely considered one of the worst sitcoms ever made, it was cheap to produce for syndication and somehow ran for 4 seasons. It's a show that people didn't just dislike, they were genuinely creeped out by it. It was a bizarre attempt at family fun, but not as depressing as what happened when a network tried to continue a beloved drama as a comedy. 8. After MASH.
How do you plead? Guilty or not guilty? Both. You can't. Has to be one or the other.
Ending one of the most beloved shows in television history is a monumental task. The final episode of MASH in 1983 was a cultural event watched by over 125 million people. So, what did CBS do just 6 months later? They launched a spin-off called After MASH, which is considered one of the most ill-advised and disliked sequels ever. The show followed 3 supporting characters from the original. These were Colonel Potter, Klinger, and Father Mulcahy, and the plot saw them trying to adjust to civilian life after the Korean War. The setting was a dreary, underfunded veterans hospital in Missouri, where Potter was the chief of staff, Klinger was his assistant, and Mulcahy was the chaplain. The show's biggest sin was its tone. MASH was famous for perfectly balancing comedy with the grim realities of conflict. After MASH, however, was just plain depressing. The characters, once part of a vibrant ensemble, now seemed sad and lost. The setting was bleak, and the plots often revolved around the grim medical and psychological problems of the veteran patients. It was a sitcom that had very little comedy. While it initially got decent ratings out of sheer curiosity, Viewers quickly abandoned it. The network retooled the show for its second season, making it lighter and sillier, but it was too late. The show was canceled, leaving fans feeling like their perfect farewell to MASH had been tarnished by a cynical and gloomy cash grab. It tried to tackle serious issues, but failed, unlike our next entry, which tried to tackle cultural issues and also failed spectacularly. 9. A.K.A. Pablo.
See, when I do that joke about the Mexican Express card with the knife, I take a little bit of truth and I extend it. A little itty-bitty bit of truth.
In the 1980s, networks were slowly starting to recognize the importance of diversity, but the execution was often clumsy and tone-deaf. A perfect example of this is the 1984 sitcom A.K.A. Pablo, produced by the legendary Norman Lear. The show was meant to be a star vehicle for up-and-coming comedian Paul Rodriguez. He played Paul Rivera, a young man known to everyone as Pablo. He was a young Hispanic comedian trying to make it big while navigating the expectations of his large, traditional Mexican-American family. The show aimed to explore the culture clash between Pablo's modern, assimilated views and his family's more old-fashioned values. It was a noble idea, but the execution was a complete mess. The central problem was that the humor relied heavily on broad, stereotypical jokes about Hispanic culture that many found offensive. The family was portrayed as loud, overbearing, and simplistic. While Norman Lear had a history of using stereotypes to make social commentary in shows like All in the Family, here it just fell flat and felt insulting. Hispanic advocacy groups protested the show, and general audiences just didn't find it funny. It was a rare misfire from a celebrated producer. The show was canceled after only 6 episodes, a high-profile failure that proved that good intentions don't automatically make for good television. It was a groundbreaking idea that backfired, much like the first attempt at an Asian-led sitcom a few years earlier.
10. Mr. T and Tina.
Tops of my wish lists of things I wanted to do before my career ended, and to have a show of your own, you know.
Long before A.K.A. Pablo tried and failed, there was Mr. T and Tina in 1976. This show holds the distinction of being one of the very first American sitcoms to feature a predominantly Asian American cast. On that merit alone, it should have been a landmark series. Instead, it was a disliked, critically panned disaster that was canceled after only 5 episodes, leaving a legacy of what not to do. The show starred the legendary Pat Morita. This was the same actor who would later find fame as Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid. He played Taro Takahashi, a brilliant Japanese inventor who moves to Chicago with his family. A free-spirited and very Americanized young woman named Tina, played by Susan Blanchard, is hired as the governess for his children. The premise was a classic fish-out-of-water culture clash comedy. Mr. T was the stern, traditional Japanese father, and Tina was the wacky American who would challenge his old-world ways. Sound familiar? The show was a blatant knockoff of a British sitcom called Mind Your Language, and the humor was almost entirely based on lazy, cringe-worthy stereotypes. Mr. T's character spoke in broken English with a heavy accent, and the jokes revolved around what the show presented as his inscrutable Asian customs versus American norms. It was hacky, unfunny, and deeply uncomfortable to watch. Critics hated it, and audiences ignored it. It remains a sad footnote in TV history, a pioneering show that was so poorly made it likely set back the cause of Asian representation on television for years. It relied on a tired formula, but at least it didn't rely on a chimpanzee. 11. Me and the Chimp.
Well, we're ready, honey.
Okay.
Push buttons, Dad.
Yeah. Okay.
Sometimes a TV show's title tells you everything you need to know about why it failed. Case in point, Me and the Chimp. This 1972 sitcom was created by Gary Marshall, the same man who would later give us classics like Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley. But this early effort was a serious misstep. The plot was simple and utterly ridiculous. A dentist named Mike Reynolds and his family find a chimpanzee who has escaped from an Air Force Space Research Center. The chimp was named Buttons. This chimp was incredibly intelligent and had been trained to be what they called a super chimp. Against all logic, the family decides to hide him in their suburban home. Each week, Buttons would inevitably escape the house and get into some kind of wacky situation, and the family would have to scramble to get him back before their nosy neighbors or the Air Force discovered their secret. The comedy was supposed to come from the chimp's antics, but it was just lowbrow slapstick. The show felt like a live-action cartoon, but without any of the charm. It was incredibly silly, even for the early 70s, and audiences were not impressed. Critics roasted it for its infantile humor and absurd premise. It was canceled after just 13 episodes and is now consistently ranked among the worst TV shows of all time. It's a baffling creation that makes you wonder what they were thinking. An animal sidekick was a bad idea, but what about a robot sidekick? 12. Holmes and Yo-Yo Long.
Can't somebody fix the captain? Oh, yes. We're very proud of Yo-Yo. We call him Yo-Yo after his creator, Gregory Yoyonovich.
Before RoboCop, there was a sitcom that tried to mine laughs from the idea of a mechanical police officer. In 1976, ABC aired Holmes and Yo-Yo, a show so goofy, it's a miracle it ever got made. It centered on Detective Alex Holmes, a clumsy but well-meaning LAPD officer. After one too many mishaps, his superiors decide to partner him with a new top-secret prototype. This was an android officer named Gregory Yoyonovich. Most people just called him Yo-Yo. He looked perfectly human, but he was a walking, talking supercomputer with photographic memory and superhuman strength. He was also completely literal-minded and prone to embarrassing malfunctions at the worst possible moments. The show was essentially a buddy cop comedy where one of the buddies was a toaster with a badge. A typical plot would involve Holmes and Yo-Yo trying to bust a criminal, only for Yo-Yo to short-circuit in the rain, start repeating everything he hears, or have his leg fall off during a chase. The humor was broad, predictable, and not very funny. The show felt like a rejected Disney movie from the 60s, completely out of place in the grittier television landscape of the 70s. It was a high-concept gimmick that wore out its welcome almost immediately. Viewers were not amused, and the show was pulled from the air after only 13 episodes. It was a bizarre failure, but it was at least a scripted failure. Our next show was a chaotic blend of music and comedy that was even more disliked. 13. Pink Lady and Jeff.
It's time to introduce a very talented guest. He's so cute and smart, and he's got the brand new NBC show on Friday nights.
In the history of television disasters, few shows are as legendary as Pink Lady and Jeff. This 1980 variety show and sitcom hybrid was a spectacular train wreck from start to finish. The show starred a musical act known as Pink Lady. This was a hugely popular female pop duo from Japan, and their names were Mie and Kei. The problem was, neither of them spoke a word of English. The network's brilliant solution was to hire comedian Jeff Altman to co-host and essentially act as their translator and comedic foil. The show was a bizarre mishmash of musical numbers, comedy sketches, and celebrity guest appearances. The result was one of the most awkward and uncomfortable shows ever broadcast. Mie and Kei would try to deliver their lines phonetically with absolutely no idea what they were saying, while Jeff would mug for the camera and try to generate laughs out of the sheer chaos. The sketches were nonsensical, and the interactions felt forced and painful to watch. A recurring gag involved the trio jumping into a hot tub at the end of every show. Why did they do this? Nobody knows. It was supposed to be a fun, quirky variety hour, but it came across as an exploitative mess that turned its Japanese stars into the butt of the joke. It was universally panned by critics and ignored by audiences, getting canceled after just 5 episodes and earning a permanent spot in the Hall of Fame for terrible television. The show's premise was confusing, but our next entry was disliked for being all too clear in its controversial message. 14. Carter Country.
Horrible word painted on it in big red letters. Now, why don't you just paint it out? I mean, it's an eyesore for the entire neighborhood. I'd rather leave it.
On the heels of the hugely successful and progressive workplace sitcom Barney Miller, ABC tried to replicate the formula in a completely different setting with Carter Country. Premiering in 1977, the show was set in the small town of Clinton Corners, Georgia, right in the heart of President Jimmy Carter's home state. The series focused on the interactions inside the local police station, led by the traditional old-school sheriff, Roy Moby. The main source of conflict came from his new deputy, a sharp, college-educated black officer from New York City named Sergeant Curtis Baker. The show aimed to find humor in the clash between the rural, white, Southern characters and the urban, black newcomer. While it aimed to be a satire about race relations in what was being called the New South, many viewers and critics found its humor to be tone-deaf and reliant on lazy stereotypes. The white characters were often portrayed as bumbling, backwoods simpletons. In this dynamic, Sergeant Baker was presented as the civilized outsider. It walked a very fine line and often stumbled into being more offensive than funny. The show was also hurt by its direct competition since it aired against ratings powerhouses like the Dukes of Hazzard and The Incredible Hulk. Despite the controversy and tough time slot, it managed to last for 2 seasons, but it was never a major hit and has been largely forgotten. It was disliked for its awkward social commentary, a problem our next show avoided by having no commentary at all. 15. The Ted Knight Show.
13.5 triple E. Well, I'm glad he lived under us and not over us.
Ted Knight was a beloved television icon thanks to his Emmy-winning role as the vain, buffoonish news anchor Ted Baxter on The Mary Tyler Moore Show. After that legendary series ended, Knight tried to strike gold again with his own star vehicle. In 1978, he starred in The Ted Knight Show, a sitcom that felt like a pale imitation of his past success. In the show, Knight played Roger Dennis, the owner of a successful escort service in New York City. Now, let's be clear, it wasn't that kind of service. Instead, this was a business that provided charming companions for social events. The main cast was made up of the attractive young men and women who worked for him. The show's premise was thin, and the humor was even thinner. The biggest problem was that the character of Roger Dennis was basically just Ted Baxter in a different job. He was arrogant, cheap, and prone to silly schemes, but he lacked the brilliant writing and ensemble cast that made the character work on The Mary Tyler Moore Show. Here, he was just an obnoxious guy surrounded by bland, forgettable younger characters. It felt like a lazy attempt to cash in on Knight's popularity without putting in the creative effort. The show was a ratings flop and was canceled before its first season was even finished. It was a sad example of a talented actor being let down by a weak concept, a fate shared by another character from a classic 70s sitcom. 16.
Checking in.
This sure was a good luncheon. I mean, everything was planned to a T.
It sure was, but I thought you planned it.
I did.
Oh, girl.
Spin-offs are a risky business, but a spin-off of a spin-off is practically a dare. The Jeffersons was itself a hugely successful spin-off of All in the Family. So, in 1981, the producers decided to tempt fate by spinning off one of the Jeffersons' most popular supporting characters, Florence Johnston, the sharp-tongued, wisecracking maid, played by Marla Gibbs. The new show, Checking In, saw Florence leave the Jeffersons' employ to become the executive housekeeper at the fictional St. Frederick Hotel in New York City. The comedy was supposed to come from Florence's no-nonsense attitude, clashing with her stuffy boss and the hotel's zany staff and guests. It seemed like a can't-miss idea. Florence was a fan favorite, a master of the deadpan comeback. But just like with Nick Tortelli, a character who is hilarious in small doses can become grating as the lead. Removed from her role as George Jefferson's comedic foil, Florence's constant sarcasm lost some of its punch. The supporting cast was weak, and the hotel setting was generic. The show was a complete ratings disaster. It was canceled after airing only 4 episodes, making it one of the most spectacular and quickest failures of the era. Marla Gibbs was quickly brought back to the Jeffersons with a storyline explaining that the hotel had burned down, erasing her brief promotion from history. A lazy main character can be a problem, but what if the main character is also a rule-breaking lawman? 17. The Misadventures of Sheriff Lobo.
It's a terrible thing when the local law can't control something like bathtub booze.
I'll bet that's something the two of you know an awful lot about.
Sometimes a show is disliked not because it's boring, but because its hero is a genuinely terrible person. That was the central problem with The Misadventures of Sheriff Lobo. This show was a spin-off of another series called BJ and the Bear, where Sheriff Elroy P. Lobo was a recurring antagonist. He was a greedy, scheming, and comically corrupt lawman in rural Orley County, Georgia. For some reason, network executives thought this smarmy villain would make a great sitcom hero. The resulting show followed Sheriff Lobo and his 2 dim-witted deputies, Perkins and Birdie, as they spent their days hatching get-rich-quick schemes instead of enforcing the law. The show was essentially a live-action cartoon. Lobo was the southern-fried Wile E. Coyote, constantly seeing his elaborate plans to make a quick buck blow up in his face. While the show was played for slapstick laughs, many viewers were uncomfortable with the very idea of a sitcom that celebrated a crooked cop. It was cynical and silly, and critics despised it. Here's the crazy part. It was actually a hit in its first season, tapping into the same country-fried action comedy vibe as the Dukes of Hazzard. But the network, hoping to make it more appealing, completely retooled the show for season 2. They moved the setting to Atlanta, made Lobo a more serious detective, and changed the title to just Lobo. The changes killed the show's goofy charm, the ratings collapsed, and it was quickly canceled. It was a show disliked by critics that was ruined when it tried to become respectable. But at least it was an original idea, unlike our next entry. 18. We Got It Made.
I'm going to cover my eyes and I'm going to count to 3. And when I open them, you'll be gone, okay? Here we go, okay? 1, 2, 3.
In the world of sitcoms, there's a fine line between inspiration and imitation. We Got It Made leaped over that line and never looked back. This 1983 sitcom was such a blatant ripoff of Three's Company that it's amazing it didn't come with a legal notice. The premise involved 2 single guys in New York City who are looking for a roommate to help pay the rent. After a series of terrible male applicants, they decide to hire a stunningly attractive but naive young woman named Mickey. Sound familiar? It was the exact same setup as Three's Company, just with the genders flipped. The 2 male roommates, a charming schemer and a nerdy intellectual, constantly competed for Mickey's affection while trying to hide their living arrangement from their suspicious landlord. The show was pure formula, lifting every trope from its far superior predecessor. There were zany misunderstandings, close calls, and plenty of jokes based on innuendo. The problem was, it had none of the charm, wit, or brilliant physical comedy that made Three's Company a smash hit. It was a lazy, carbon copy sitcom that offered viewers nothing new. Despite being universally panned by critics as an unoriginal clone, the show was a surprise ratings hit for its first season, proving that audiences sometimes don't mind a little familiarity. However, the novelty wore off fast. The show was canceled by NBC, then revived a few years later for for syndication with a mostly new cast, where it failed all over again. It was a show disliked for its sheer lack of originality, which is something our next entry can't be accused of.